having heard about two Lutherans who spent their whole life in Germany, Kleefeld and Filmar, this last talk is going to be about Friedrich Johann Karl Lochner, usually referred to as Friedrich Lochner, who was born in Nuremberg in 1822 and died in Milwaukee in 1902. His father was a copper plate printer, but many of his ancestors, going back 300 years, had been Lutheran clergy. As a young man, Lochner entered the studio of a noted copper plate engraver in Nuremberg and became familiar with that line of work, also becoming interested in music, and in fact took lessons from the organist of the St. Sibalda's Church in Nuremberg and the St. Lawrence Church in Nuremberg, which are the two great large churches in Nuremberg, which I believe suffered in World War II but were meticulously reconstructed after the war. In due course, his teacher moved to Munich, and there that teacher received him into his home with some other students, and Lochner speaks of this as perhaps the most beautiful time of his life. It was a devoutly Christian family. But while he pursued his copper plate engraving type of work, he was reading mission periodicals, and there was aroused in him a desire for mission work among the heathen. And so in due course, he entered Wilhelm Leah's seminary, which Leah had to prepare pastors to serve among the German immigrants in North America. And finally, Lochner and a number of Franconians, Franconia being the part of Bavaria in which Nuremberg is found, they sailed on April the 20th, 1845, and after 51 days at sea, they arrived in New York. They went on out to Michigan, to a place called Monroe, and 6 weeks after arriving there, he accepted a call to a small church in Toledo. And on August the 10th, 1845, he was ordained by Pastor Schmidt, Cronenwet, and Hutstedt. Lochner had been told by Leah that he should connect when he got to America with Walther and the Saxon immigrants in Missouri, and then, of course, with the Bavarian immigrants up in Michigan. And he met with Walther and Kyle and Furbringer and Binger and Lober and Schieferdecker in the spring of 1845. And it was about this same time that Lochner discovered that the church he had been called to in Toledo was not really Lutheran. It was a church of mixed confession. It was much the same experience that Friedrich Lochner had here in Baltimore when he was called by the group that had withdrawn from Zion Church to continue as at least Christians. And Wyneken discovered that too was a congregation of mixed confession. So anyway, he resigned his call to the Toledo church, and then from December 1846 to June 1850, he served a number of country congregations in Illinois and Missouri. And then in the year 1850, he was called to be pastor of Trinity Church in Milwaukee. And he was installed there in June of, well, no, I mixed up, no. 1 year after he arrived at Trinity, the Fourth Synodical Convention of the Missouri Synod was held at Trinity in June of 1851. And Lochner was there for the following 25 years. He was there for a good long time. And while he was pastor there, Trinity also founded St. Stephen's Church, Emmanuel Church, and Bethlehem Church. And then finally, in 1875, he received a call to Trinity Church in Springfield, Illinois. And in addition to being pastor of Trinity, he was also called to teach liturgics and hymnology to the students there, and also be a spiritual advisor to the students of the Springfield Seminary. The move from Milwaukee to Springfield was, in one sense, difficult, and part of this can be seen in what Lochner in later life had to say about that. And I'll read you just an excerpt from his book, Der Hauptgottesdienst, of which I'll have more to say. But in that book, Lochner is talking about the move to Springfield. And he has this to say. He says, after 26 years of service in one of our old liturgically rich congregations, I was placed into a congregation that was not ready for the old liturgy, so that even the chanting at the altar had to be omitted for some time. And so I could not show my students in my church services there everything in which I had in fact instructed them, but I could give them an example that a Lutheran pastor puts the highest value on good preaching and can wait to reach a better liturgical form. He says that on the one hand, he has great love and enthusiasm for the old liturgy, and at the same time can say with St. Paul, also in this respect, by God's grace, I know how both to abound and suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So, having had 25 years at Trinity Milwaukee, a congregation with a rich liturgical life, he then, from 1876 to 1877, was pastor at Trinity in Springfield and taught at the seminary. It was because of his health. Around 1887, he developed asthma and also some other health issues, and he had to retire from his position at Trinity Springfield, and he moved back to Milwaukee, and his health improved to the point where from then, 1887, until his death in February 1902, he served as an assistant pastor at Trinity in Milwaukee. I should also say something about Lochner's family life. He had 3 wives, not simultaneously, mind you. His first wife was Lydia Binger, whom he married in June 1845, and 3 years later she died as a result of complications during childbirth, and then 3 months later the little daughter she'd given birth to also died. So that was in 1848. In February of 1849, he married Maria Bamy, who was an old friend of his first wife, and she bore him 10 children. So his second wife gave him 10 children. But sadly, during his last year in Springfield, Maria died of typhoid fever. 5 years later, which would be 1892, he was 5 years a widower. He married Maria von Halgwitz, who came from an old family of the nobility in Silesia. Maria von Halgwitz's forebears were related to Catherine von Bora, Luther's wife. And anyway, Maria von Halgwitz, she bore 3 sons, Martin, Louis, and William. Louis Lochner grew up to become a correspondent for the Associated Press. And he, in fact, was the man in Germany during the rise of Hitler and continued in Germany until our country entered the war. Louis Lochner, he wrote a wonderful book of memoirs. It's called Always the Unexpected. And it gives a very interesting account of his whole life. But it also has, the first chapter, of course, is about how life was in Milwaukee with his father and at Trinity Church and so on. I should mention also this in connection with his time at Trinity in Milwaukee when he was pastor there 25 years. When he got there, there was a school teacher, and the school teacher's name was August Lemke. Does that ring a bell with anyone? August Lemke.
He was a school teacher?
Yeah. I see Father Brian shaking his head, yes.
Lemke was a common name in the Wisconsin Synod, it seems, so.
Oh, okay.
So I know the Lemke name, but I think I've heard of an August Lemke somewhere.
Yeah, and he is the author of our familiar tune for Lift Up Your Heads, Ye Mighty Gates. Lift up your heads, ye mighty gates, behold the King. It's Wisconsin Synod?
That's what it's also been called, or Milwaukee.
Okay.
So.
It's been called and it's also been called the Missouri Waltz. I've heard it called that. I like it. It's what I grew up with. But anyway, August Lemke was teacher when Lochner arrived there. So this is an overview of Lochner's life. And what I now want to talk about is this book that he wrote, Der Hauptgottesdienst der evangelisch-lutherischen Kirche, the chief service of the Evangelical Lutheran Church, which I understand has been translated into English, and the music which is in it has been adapted to English words. And I was told some time ago that the English edition of Lochner's Der Hauptgottesdienst was to be ready in time for this summer's synodical convention. But now I understand that it will be at Christmas. It should be out in time for Christmas. And I suppose from here on, this could be construed as kind of a book review or a commercial for this book. But I do very much recommend it to everyone. Its origin happens to be the lectures that Friedrich Lochner gave at the Springfield Seminary from 1876 to 1887. It also is grounded in a convention address which he gave in 1861 for, I believe it was the Northern District of Synod. And this convention essay was then published in the Synod's theological journal of those days, Lehre und Vera, in June, July, and August of 1861. So Lochner's interest in the liturgy goes back to his days in Germany and certainly the influence of Wilhelm Löhe. In der Hauptgottesdienst, when you look at the music, you'll often find a reference to a man by the name of Friedrich Leyriz, Layriz. And he was an acquaintance of Wilhelm Löhe, and it was in fact Leyriz who provided the musical materials in Wilhelm Löhe's agenda, which, as some of you may remember, was dedicated to Friedrich Wienecken. The Löhe agenda was dedicated to Friedrich Wienecken. So, der Hauptgottesdienst, the chief service of the Lutheran Church. Just one more aside before I go on to this. I had mentioned how Lochner, as a young man, when he was still studying this copperplate profession or trade, that he became interested in missions to the heathen. And that was an interest that continued throughout his life, because in addition to his various liturgical writings, he also was co-editor of a publication I had never heard of till recently. I read an article by Dr. Mackenzie, Cameron Mackenzie, on Lochner's life, and he was co-editor of a periodical published by Concordia Publishing House. It was called Die Missionstaube. Die Missionstaube. Taube is German for dove. So the name of this publication seems to have been the mission dove, but his interest, he was not only interested liturgically and also musically and sacramentally, but his interest in missions continued. He published a number of books, and I have several of them here from the Fort Wayne Seminary's collection. He published a history of Trinity Church in Milwaukee, where he was for 25 years pastor, and then for 15 years he was associate pastor. And this was published in 1897. So this is a history of Trinity, Milwaukee. This is a book much like the, what do we call it nowadays? The Pastor's Companion? The
Little Agenda.
Little Agenda, yes. I show my age when I say Pastor's Companion. That's what it was called, the edition back in 1968. But it has a number of forms for baptisms, for dedication of churches, prayers for the sick and the dying, and so forth. And he has forms for the reception into membership in a Lutheran church. And he has a special form for receiving converts from the Roman Catholic Church. And it is a very explicit form in which the person seeking membership in the Lutheran Church is asked that do you renounce the Bishop of Rome as the Antichrist and his kingdom and so forth and so on. So there was no, yes, equivocation there. He also published an interesting little booklet called Feasts and Customs, Feste und Gebrauche, of the Lutheran and the Catholic Church for everyone's instruction. And this was published in 1897 by the publication house of none other than the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Wisconsin. So it's an interesting overview of customs, both among Lutherans and also Roman Catholics. Also here, this is called a Passions book, a Passion book. And this, I think, ties in with what Father Douglas talked to us about this morning, about the church in the home. And this basically is a whole collection of meditations, hymns, and prayers for use in the Christian home during the season of Lent. And this is based on writings of 17th century Lutheran worthies. So that gives some kind of a sense of the kinds of things Lochner did. Now, the Hauptgottesdienst, it's interesting that on the opposite page of the very first chapter, he prints out the opening words of Article 24 of the Augsburg Confession. Our churches are falsely accused of abolishing the Mass, for the Mass is retained among us and celebrated with the highest reverence. All the usual ceremonies are preserved, save that the parts hitherto in Latin are interspersed with German hymns and so on. So he nails his colors to the mast. He's very emphatic about that. And then he begins this study of the chief service by reviewing its early history in the church. He, for example, refers to the rather well-known description of St. Justin Martyr of the outline of the service, which is basically, the lessons, the gospel, the sermon, the prayers, and then the Holy Eucharist. Yes. In the introductory chapter, before I say something about that, let me just make a comment about music. I mentioned Lochner's early musical interest, and one thing that is absolutely clear as you read this book is that his intense interest in music continued. He was knowledgeable in things having to do with music, and was not reluctant to express views as to how prelude should be played, the choice of music. And in those days, as it was until fairly recent times in our synod, the chanting of the pastor at the communion service was often accompanied by the organ. That's the way I experienced that at Martini in South Baltimore. And Lochner complains that some organists are just brutal to the pastors, and that how that has to be accompanied, sort of softly and carefully and so forth and so on. So the musical interest is great, and I'll have some more to say about that as we go on. In the opening chapter, he also discusses at some length the historic vestments of the Mass. And he refers to Apology of the Augsburg Confession 24, where it is said, the usual ceremonies, including the order of lessons, prayers, and vestments, the customary vestments. And then he gives some information on the retention of the vestments in early Lutheranism. He notes that as late as 1717, at a service for the 200th anniversary of the Reformation in Dresden, the chasuble was worn, also for the dedication of a new church in Dresden in 1730. And he notes that in his hometown of Nuremberg, the chasuble continued to be worn until 1790. And he also notes that here in America, at the consecration of a church building of the Norwegian Synod in Wisconsin, the then president of the Norwegian Synod was vested in a chasuble. And Lochner goes on to say it was rationalism which at least in the German Lutheran Church did its vandal work, Vandalenarbeit, its vandal work on the church vestments in the interest of the improvement of religion, in German Religionsbesserung, making religion better. So having discussed all the vestments and explained them in their youth, he goes on to say, sadly, quote, "In the restoration of the old Lutheran liturgy, both for the sake of peace and other reasons, there can be no question of reintroducing even the surplice. And we must therefore content ourselves with the black gown." The German he uses Amtskleid, means clothing of the office, which at the time of the founding of our synod was seldom seen in this land of Reformed sectarianism. In other words, saying that about the time synod was founded, it was rare in churches in America even to find the black gown in use. That's rather astonishing, but that continued for some time. For example, I suppose one of the great liturgical scholars of the, late 19th and 20th century was Luther Dotterer Reed. I suspect many of us are familiar with his book, The Lutheran Liturgy. Luther Dotterer Reed. He was born in 1872 and he died in 1968. Wonderful, wonderful old gentleman. But when he was first ordained, he had a parish outside Pittsburgh, and there he had to introduce the black gown. Even that had to be introduced. So, there were lots of challenges for people who were interested in all of this. In this book, Der Hauptgottesdienst, Lochner has a lot to say about music, and he assumes that both the congregation and the choir will be actively involved. He provides both the traditional Gregorian chant for the pastor's part of the liturgy, and also he provides chant forms from post-Reformation Lutheran sources. He provides simple Gregorian psalm tones for all the introits of the church year, and he assumes that the introit will be sung by two choirs singing back and forth antiphonally. Whether that was the case at Trinity Milwaukee, I don't know, but that is what he implies. For the Kyrie, he provides Luther's familiar setting, which we all know from Divine Service 3, which comes from Luther's German Mass. And for the Gloria, he provides two metrical versions. One is the very familiar, "All glory be to God on high, all glory be to God on high, who hath our race." And then also Luther's, "All glory be to God alone, forevermore the highest one." He also provides a setting from the Strasbourg Church Order of 1525, also found in the Palatinate Order of 1570, with the harmonization found in the Bavarian Agenda. It's based on plain song, basically. It is based on plain song. And he also, interestingly, provides a musical setting of the Gloria in Excelsis by Dmitri Bortniansky, whose dates are 1750 to 1825. And of course, Bortniansky's music was written for the Russian Church. So Lochner also provides that. So when this comes out, if anybody wants their choir to sing a nice Russian musical setting of the Gloria, you'll have it there. I can't imagine people will be rushing to do that, but That was not intended. That was a slip of the tongue. So, yes, for the collect sung by the pastor, he provides the traditional Gregorian chants, which go way, 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 way back. And he also provides settings found in Friedrich Lochner's book, a book called Kern des Deutschen Kirchengesang, a core of German church music. And as I mentioned, Lochner was the one who provided the music for Leah's agenda, and Lochner often refers to his works. Yes. Now, he also gives as examples a chant form both for the epistle and for the gospel. And these chant forms are based on Luther's German Mass of 1526. The melodies you heard me sing this morning were the old Gregorian settings, both for the epistle and the gospel. Well, what does Lochner have to say about the chanting of the pericopes? He has this to say, and I quote, "Because of the dominance of rationalism in Germany and of Puritanism and Methodism in this country, the liturgical chant has generally disappeared and in so many congregations is thought to be something Katholisch. And so there can be no question of reintroducing the singing of the pericopes, even in congregations where the singing of the other customary parts of the Mass is now customary or can be reintroduced." So just as Lochner thought it was out of the question to reintroduce even the surplice, let alone the Eucharistic vestments, so in the same way he felt that given our circumstances here in America, at least in his day, the singing of the lessons would be something just a bit too much. When we come to the creed, it's very interesting. He gives a four-part musical setting for the singing of the text of the Apostles' Creed, which comes from an early, the Braunschweig-Lüneburg church order of 1542. He also provides a full musical setting of the Nicene Creed, and this comes from a book of a man by the name of Lucas, does one say Losius? Lucas Losius in 1553, which also appears in the Pomeranian Church Order of 1563 and in the Wittenberg Hymnal of 1573. And when you go through that setting, it's very similar to the setting of the Nicene Creed that we sang both yesterday and today. And the setting we sang yesterday and today is known as Credo number 3 in the Roman Catholic, the Liber Usualis and the Gradual. It's setting number 3. It's also sometimes referred to as the Missa de Angelis setting. And interestingly enough, I mean, every time I see a papal mass on television, I tend not to watch them these days, but for various reasons. That seems to be the setting that people know. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty. And interestingly enough, it wasn't until a few years ago that I realized that in Divine Service 3, or page 15 in the Lutheran hymnal, the music for Glory Be to Thee, O Lord, is actually the music of the intonation of Creed 3. Glory be to Thee, O Lord, I believe in one God. So it's curious how these melodies migrate from place to place and are set under different words. And he, of course, also refers to the singing of Luther's paraphrase of the Nicene Creed, "We all believe in one true God." And that was of course, in our synod's German hymnal and German agenda, that was the form of creed which was to be sung. You may notice that in the 1941 Lutheran hymnal, 2 tunes are given for that. One is Luther's historic tune, and the other is an 18th century tune. "We all believe in one true God, da, 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 da." It's much easier. But I'm told that at Old Martini in the days of German services, when the organist would dare to play the alternative tune, my grandmother would look up and glare at him for daring to do this. And of course, there's an intonation for that. Ich glaube an einen Gott. Is that correct, Father Stefan? Is that, or Matthew? Ich glaube. I should look right in this book. But anyway, the pastor would intone it, and just, "I believe in one God," and then the people would sing, "Wir glauben an einen Gott, Schöpfer Himmels und den Erden. Ich glaube an einen Gott." Yeah. Ich glaube an einen Gott. So anyway, but I guess one point I'd want to make here, this is kind of a bee in my bonnet. I wish that in the restoration of our liturgical and musical heritage, we could somehow find our way back to singing the Nicene Creed. Interestingly enough, the 1982 Lutheran worship provides the setting we used this morning. But it was not kept in the LSB, so I mean, it's something to think about. And in the old liturgical movement in the Missouri Synod of the Society of St. James, one of the things that congregations that were involved in that, they would have the singing of the Creed. The Creed would be sung either to the Credo 3 or to Credo 1, which is called the tonus authenticus, the authentic tone. And it's much more modal kind of thing. The version we sang this morning has almost a folk song quality about it, whereas the tonus authenticus, "I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth," and so weiter, and so forth and so on. So, anyway, worth thinking about. Yes?
Would that be the same for the Vaterunser as well?
No.
Not sung or not?
What?
Not sung?
Oh, no, the Father Unser would be sung, of course. Yes. I mean, yes, in the service of Holy Communion, the Vater Unser would certainly be sung, and I have some notes about that from Lochner too, and about the melodies that I used this morning and yesterday and whatnot. So we're through the Creed, the sermon. In Lochner's version of the Hauptgottesdienst, the confession and absolution and the prayer of the church immediately follow the sermon and are done in the pulpit. And this was true in Synod's German agenda. The German service of our Synod, confession and absolution and the prayer of the church are in the pulpit. And then it goes on with the so-called offertory, which leads into the actual Holy Eucharist itself. When it comes to the preface, Lochner gives the traditional, what's called the ferial tone of the preface. It's simpler than what I sang this morning. It just goes, "It is truly meet, right, and salutary that we should at all times and in all places give thanks unto thee, O Lord, Holy Father, Almighty, everlasting God." Is the word for it melismos? Is that the word for it? Which and the form I sang this morning, it's actually the so-called solemn tone of the preface, the solemn tone. And in the pre-Reformation missals, the solemn tone was used for Sundays and feasts. The ferial tone was used on weekdays. Lochner gives the ferial tone, and the book called Common Service Music, which was published in 1906 and edited by a committee here in Baltimore and harmonized by Louis Calmer, who taught at Peabody Conservatory, it gives the ferial tone for the preface. In Synod's German agenda, the preface is set to a collect tone. Lochner deplores it. He thinks it is truly, well, anyway, it's not very interesting. And then, of course, there's the Sanctus, and the familiar Sanctus from Divine Service 3, when Lochner, he puts where everything's from. And the Sanctus from Divine Service 3, he has the word unbekannt. Nobody knows where it came from. Nobody knows where it came from. Lochner provides a setting of the Sanctus from Spangenberg, 1545, and also Sanctus from Losius' Psalmodia of 1551. And that Sanctus is essentially the plain song, Gregorian chant, Mass 9. And Luther's Isaiah Mighty Seer in Days of Old, that is based on that Sanctus. Da, 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 da. And that Sanctus is da, 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 da. So those are some of the roots of that music. The Our Father and the Consecration, Lochner gives three forms. He gives Luther's form of the consecration, and that's the one we have in the Lutheran service book. Our Lord Jesus Christ, the same night in which he was betrayed, and so forth. He also gives the Bugenhagen form, which is what I sang this morning. Our Lord Jesus Christ, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and so forth. And interestingly enough, all the way up through the 1944 Music for the Liturgy, published in our synod, that was the form, that was the music for the consecration. And it was only, I think, with the 1982 Lutheran worship that Luther's form was restored. There's nothing wrong with it, but the Bugenhagen form was at one time much more common in our circles. Then, of course, when Lochner comes to the Agnus Dei, he refers to the familiar chant that we have in Divine Service 3, which again comes from Bugenhagen, the Braunschweig church order. And then as an alternative, Lamb of God, pure and holy, O Lamm Gottes unschuldig. And that melody is also based on the Agnus Dei of Mass 9, the same, O Lamb of God that takest away, and so forth. So these Gregorian melodies were adapted in the Reformation and put into a form that could be easily sung by the people, and for that we are all very grateful. He gives a setting of the Nunc Dimittis, which is virtually the same as what we sing in Divine Service 3. That pretty well covers the musical, a sort of an outline of what the music is like in Lochner's work. And if you all get that book, you'll be able to look at this yourselves and ponder it and see what there is useful. Lochner also had an appendix to his Der Hauptgottesdienst, and that appendix is based on a book of this name, The Evangelical Church Building, Advice for Clergy and Friends of Church Art, published in cooperation with a member of the Board of Works, Dr. Mathis in Leipzig, and architect Prusser in Berlin, by Victor Schulze, professor of theology, Leipzig, published in Leipzig by George Behme. It discusses the way the church should be arranged, the nave, the chancel, the altar, the font, the pulpit, all of that, and it's useful. The only thing I'll mention in some detail from it, and that very briefly, is the color usage that appears in this appendix. And it has some applicability, I think, to our own usages. This is the color usage. Violet is used for Advent and for Lent, beginning with Septuagesima. Violet, beginning with Septuagesima. White is used for Christmas, to Epiphany, for Easter, and for the purification, annunciation, and visitation of Mary. Green is used in Epiphany Tide until Septuagesima, and for Trinity Tide. Red is used, and here this is somewhat different. Red is used for Pentecost, but also for Trinity Sunday, for St. John the Baptist, and for Apostles' Days. And then black is used for Good Friday, Days of Repentance, and for what he calls Trauergottesdiensten, mourning services, presumably funerals. And one puzzlement I have, and I've never learned where it came from. We've had, according to our service books, for a very long time, the rubrics say that for weddings and for funerals, the color of the day should be used. The color of the day should be used. But when I was growing up at Martini, until Pastor Engelbert's retirement, funerals were in black and weddings were in white. That's not to say that's what has to be, but it's interesting. And apparently the use of black for funerals was once very customary. And I don't know where that rubric to follow the color of the day comes from. The farthest I've been able to trace it back is the Common Service with Hymnal of 1917. The 1917 Common Service book with hymnal, because that has that rubric, that funerals and weddings are in the color of the day. So where that comes from, I don't know. Matthew, do you know anything about that?
I don't know anything about that.
Okay. Matthew is a fund of knowledge about these usages. And of course, the other thing I would mention is that in this color scheme, violet is used for pre-Lent rather than green. And that was the preferred usage in the altar book which accompanied the 1941 Lutheran hymnal. The general.
To that, right?
What's that?
There's two editions of that.
Yeah.
They changed the rubric in there.
They did. The earlier it was green, it was white for all of Epiphany and green for Gesimas. And then in the 1955 rubrics, it's green for the Epiphany Sundays and violet for the Gesimas, which is the older usage actually. It's the older usage. The use of green for the Gesimas seems to be a distinctly German Lutheran custom. Because if you look at the German hymnals, I mean, I have a copy of the our sister church's book and also of the Bavarian church's book, and they have the usage of green for the Jesuits. Well, this is a kind of, I hope, helpful overview of Lochner's work. Do you have any questions, or should we perhaps, yes?
Father, if I make a comment, Zion is put into publication of Friedrich Lochner's Children's Christmas Book. And the previous pastor of Zion translated it from the German. He got it from Trinity, Milwaukee. And it is available from Zion for free in electronic form. The original title is A Liturgy for einen Kindergottesdienst zur vierten Heiligen Weihnacht. And we retain that title in the program.
So you can get Lochner's proposal for a service.
Children's Christmas, yeah, it's really good. We've used it for a number of years.
He also published a form for the Good Friday service. There was a form for the Good Friday service, and it looks like it was intended for a rather lengthy Good Friday afternoon with various hymns and prayers and responsories, at least one of which is from the text of the Old Tenebrae service.
Did you have any ceremonial discussion in this?
Very minimal. Very minimal. I mean, he does talk about the placement of the sacred vessels on the altar. And his recommendations for that are essentially what you also find in Synod's German agenda. And the practice, which continues in any number of churches still, is the chalice, the paten, the ciborium or host box, and the flagon are placed at the epistle side of the altar, the right-hand side, and covered with a veil. And then at the offertory, or when the vessels are prepared for communion, the vessels for the bread are placed on the gospel side, and the vessels for the wine are placed on the epistle side. And that was the custom in the church I grew up in.
Manuel Dearborn still consecrates in that.
Yeah, it actually is prescribed in Synod's German agenda. The German agenda actually says to arrange them that way. And pictures I've seen online of churches in Germany, it seems to be something that goes on there too. So, but the question about does he have ceremonial recommendations, he mentions that, and also that they should be brought together and veiled again after communion, not just left strewed all over the altar.
To clarify, they're actually at the two different ends of the altar.
Yeah. And in that case, you have two corporals. The parish where I served as assistant in the suburbs of Chicago for a number of years, St. Paul's Addison, that was the custom when I got there, that everything was on the epistle side, and then when the vessels were unveiled, the vessels for the bread were put at the gospel side with a corporal under them.
Still consecrated ad orientem now?
Oh yes.
None of this is John Henry Newman stuff.
No, there was no attempt to turn to the people. I never saw that in Missouri churches.
But you would consecrate and then walk over.
Yeah, you would go from. Yeah. Have you seen this, everybody? I mean, it's. Yeah. I mean, I'm not recommending it, but it's just. I mean, he does discuss that, but I don't. He really doesn't go into ceremonial things. I mean, he does from time to time stress the importance of reverence in everything that the pastor does and says at the altar. That he stresses emphatically. Yes. So I think clearly he was one of the great men in our synod, And this book really, it's to me, it's rather a pity that it hasn't been translated into English until now. Yes.
Was his immigration to America shaped by the Prussian Union at all, or was?
I don't think so. It was more the idea that he wanted to be a missionary to the heathen, and also to take care of the Germans who had immigrated.
But heathen, did you mean American Protestants or Indians?
Indians. No, he would not have thought of them as heathen. And really, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, I mean, I'm no authority on Leah, but I believe that these pastors he prepared for America, I mean, the whole way that came about was because of Winnikin's, it was called Notruf, Cry of Distress, that Leah received back in Germany. Winnikin said, you know, these people, they live like, he was describing what Baltimore was like essentially when he arrived here about 1839 or so. I mean, he said vice is not hidden, it just publicly parades itself. And yes.
For sources, do you know, did he look at any of Clifford's writing? His Liturgische Abhandlungen?
He may have. I don't actually remember. There are a number of references to various works. Leyritz is the one he usually, and also Schaberlein. Are you familiar with Schaberlein? He was a 19th century German, and he published a number of musical things from the old church orders. But I'm not sure.
It'd be interesting to compare the music there with Clifford's Cantionale, which I think Misaki has maybe one or two of the volumes, but they're not widely accessible.
Well, that would be very interesting too. I mean, I think there was clearly these men, I mean, they influenced, I think, one another's works. But I would just, not to repeat myself endlessly, but when the English translation comes out, it's definitely something worth having. It's fascinating what he has to say.